Nothing But the Truth. Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa from India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. Every week, we will focus on key issues of concern and bring you perspectives and insights as to why these matter to you and the clear truth that emerges. Let's give it to Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He has an incredible sense of timing that is the reason for his success. Prime Minister Modi demonstrated that in full measure at the first session of the newly constructed Parliament of India. He called for a special session of Parliament on September 20th and then dramatically announced that his government would enact a legislation that would politically empower women, and the bill would ensure that up to 33% of seats would be reserved in the 543-member Lok Sabha or lower house of Parliament for women, and that all the 28 state assemblies in India would have a third of the total seats reserved for women. Since this required a constitutional amendment, both houses of Parliament, the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, had to pass the bill with a two-thirds majority. That was done super fast, and on the late night of September 21st, the historic 106th Constitution Amendment was passed. The quota bill, mind you, had been hanging fire for 27 years, since 1996, and Prime Minister Modi can rightfully take credit for clearing this big bang legislation in just 2 days, thereby creating electoral history. So in this episode of Nothing But the Truth, let's answer the key questions. Why did Prime Minister Modi enact the women's quota bill at the fag end of his second term and not much earlier? When will women enjoy the reservation quota that had been promised in this act? Will the women's legislation politically benefit the Prime Minister and the Bharatiya Janata Party or the BJP in the upcoming state assembly elections that includes Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh and Telangana? And very importantly, will it give the BJP a decisive edge in the 2024 general election? So first, let's begin by looking at why the Prime Minister chose the last 6 months of his second term to enact the women's quota bill. Mind you, the BJP had listed this bill as its manifesto promise when it won a full majority in 2014, and also repeated it in 2019 when the party won a majority again. Now, if you look at the Prime Minister's track record, there are two distinctive trends. Firstly, the Prime Minister has a penchant for making big bang reforms. Secondly, nothing he ever does is random, and all the dots of his actions are connected in some way or the other. Let me quickly recap some of his big bang measures that he took in his first term. I will cite just 4 of them. When it came to welfare measures, as soon as he took charge in 2014, he successfully launched the Swachh Bharat or Clean India program. In this, over 110 million toilets were built in houses for the weaker sections, and it has all but put an end to open defecation. Then in the Ujjwala scheme that gave free gas connections to over 96 million needy households, that again was a big benefit for women. So together these two schemes directly impacted the ease of living for women, as did the opening of 500 million Jan Dhan accounts for the unbanked. Now, in terms of the economy, there was 2 or 3 big bang measures, and I'll only mention 2 of them. One was, of course, demonetization of high-value currency in November 2016 to ostensibly rid the economy of black money, and of course, as we know, that met with mixed success. And in July 2017, the passage of the National Goods and Services Tax or GST that rationalized and simplified central and state taxes across the country. Now, both of these were big bang measures. And finally, just before the 2019 general election, the Pulwama terror attack in February saw the Prime Minister sanction Air Force jet strikes against a terrorist camp deep inside Pakistan. This was the first time that the Indian Air Force struck across the border since the 1971 Bangladesh war. Then in the Prime Minister's second term that began in 2019, Prime Minister Modi began with 2 big bang measures. The first, of course, was the abrogation of Article 370 to end the ambiguity about the status of Jammu and Kashmir. And the second big development, though had nothing really to do with the Modi government, but it was the Supreme Court permitting the building of the Ram temple over the dispute site, ending decades of turmoil, strife, and angst. Then the COVID pandemic struck, and this was early 2020, followed by a global economic collapse, which saw India's economy being gutted, apart from the loss of lives and the impact on health that all of us had to face. To add to the government's woes, in the thick of the first wave of COVID, there was a major border clash with China in Ladakh that saw soldiers from both sides lose lives for the first time in over 50 years. The Modi government seemed to have successfully weathered this trinity of crisis, as the India Today Mood of the Nation poll indicates, though there are deep concerns on the performance of the Indian economy. More recently, Prime Minister Modi also pulled off a grand success in the G20 summit in Delhi, with India emerging, as we know, as the voice of the global south and, as an official put it, as the Vishwamitra, or friend of the world. Despite being in his 10th year as Prime Minister, there were no visible signs of anti-incumbency. Prime Minister Modi's personal popularity, as polls indicate, has remained extremely high. Therefore, in his final months of his second term, Prime Minister Modi made 3 more big bang moves. In the midst of the G20 summit, he pushed for Bharat as being the representative name for India. Then he called for a one nation, one poll and formed a committee to go into it urgently. The idea was essentially to hold Lok Sabha and state assembly elections together rather than them being staggered, and this was ostensibly to save the nation both time and money. And the biggest bang of them all was the Women's Reservation Act. The Women's Quota Bill is an idea whose time had come many decades ago and almost went. Just a brief history. The first move to institutionalize women's political empowerment came when Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister. In 1989, he moved the Panchayati Raj Bill that, among other things, ensured that 1/3 of the seats in local bodies and municipalities would be reserved for women candidates. That failed to find ratification in the Rajya Sabha and it lapsed. The Panchayati Raj Bill was subsequently taken up by the Congress leader Prime Minister Narasimha Rao when he was Prime Minister and was made into law in 1993. The first bill to be moved for reservations for women in the Lok Sabha and the state legislatures was introduced in 1996 when Deva Gowda was Prime Minister. But his government too didn't have the majority to do so, and the bill lapsed with the dissolution of the House. When A.B. Vajpayee became Prime Minister in 1998, he introduced the bill 3 times, in 1999, 2002 and 2003, but it could not pass the majority test. Then in 2010, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, in the first year of his second term, introduced the bill again. While it was passed in the Rajya Sabha amidst great acrimony, it was not pursued in the Lok Sabha subsequently, as the Congress feared it didn't have a majority, and it lapsed after the Congress party lost power. By then, India's record in women's representation in parliament and in state legislatures was truly abysmal. Despite women constituting nearly half of the total electorate of 900 million in the country, when it came to the Lok Sabha, there were only 82 women who were elected in 2019 in a house of 543. That's just 15%. This is far below the global average of 26%. In state assemblies, the situation is worse. Women account for only 10% of the elected members in these assemblies. India has also, unfortunately, a very poor record when it comes to gender equity. In the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Study, which looks at education, health, economic and political opportunities for women, India's rank was below 100 out of the nearly 150 countries surveyed. That's how bad the situation is. With the Women's Reservation Act, India will now happily join 40 other nations, including our neighbors Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal and China, that have reserved seats for women in various legislatures. If enacted in the 24 elections, and I'm just giving an example, women members would go up from the current 82 to at least 179 in one shot. That's close to 100 additional women parliamentarians that would be added. There were other factors that would push Prime Minister Modi to enact the Women's Reservation Act at this moment. Women voters had become a huge and decisive vote bank. In fact, in the 2019 Lok Sabha polls, over 67% of the women electorate voted, slightly higher than the amount of men who voted. And why is that significant? Because in the previous decades, it was usually women's voting was usually well below 50% of the total electorate of women. The second factor, and why the BJP and Prime Minister Modi did it, was that with 5 state elections due later this year and the 2024 general election just 6 months away, Prime Minister Modi would emerge as the champion of gender justice. This could sway the women vote significantly towards the BJP in these elections. Now, having answered why Prime Minister Modi pushed through the Women's Quota Act, now let's look at when will this representation become a reality or become possible. Herein lies the catch. And after all the euphoria it created, this catch may significantly impede the overall success of the act and reduce the women's support for the BJP. And I will go into the reasons why, but first, let's talk about the 5 major changes the act would bring about. The first, that in the Lok Sabha, up to 1/3 of the seats would be reserved for women. The second is that in state assemblies, 33% of the seats too would be reserved for women. The third is that the act mandates that 1/3 of the seats reserved for scheduled castes and tribes be set aside for women in these categories. The fourth point the law makes, is that the act also stipulates that a reservation would continue for a period of 15 years from the commencement of the act, which can be extended by Parliament if it so desires. The quota, however, will not apply to either the Rajya Sabha or the upper house of state legislatures who are nominated through indirect elections. The fifth, this is very important, is that unlike the UPA Bill of 2010, the Women's Reservation Act will kick in only after the completion of the delimitation exercise based on the first census to be conducted after its passage. The delimitation exercise, just to give you a brief background of that, is mandated by the Article 170 of the Indian Constitution, and it is meant to redraw the boundaries of the legislative constituencies to reflect the changes in population after every census. 4 such delimitation exercises have been conducted, and this went on till 1976. However, there was a problem. Population-based delimitation meant that states with higher population growth, mostly in North India, ended up with a greater number of seats in Parliament. To allay such fears and concerns of unequal political representation expressed by states, particularly the developed states in the south and in the west, the constitution was amended in 1976 to suspend the entire delimitation process that would have increased the number of seats until 2001. But another amendment in 2001 postponed this process by 25 years. The same problems arose of the fears of the southern and western states saying that they would lose out, and so there was an amendment done in 2001 that stipulated that it would be postponed by 25 years and also said it will be done based on the first census after 2026. That's very, very important, because ordinarily that would have meant the 2031 census. Because when you're saying after 2026, the first census should have been 2031, because we do decadal census surveys. But since the 2021 national census was postponed because of COVID, the Modi government may well decide to conduct a census and release it on 2026. That could then pave the way for delimitation and the Women's Reservation Bill to be implemented by 2029, 6 years from now, mind you. But this is easier said than done. In 2002, just to give you an example, when a new delimitation act was passed to redraw the existing number of parliamentary and legislative assembly constituencies, it took 5 years for the commission to give its report, and they did so only in 2007. So going by past experience, many political experts opine that possibly the first election where the women's quota would become operative would only be in 2034, 10 years from now. That's one of the reasons that the opposition parties clubbed the new Women's Quota Act as nothing more than a political jumla and call it an electorally motivated move, as the BJP government has not fixed an exact time for its implementation. BJP leaders argue that there is a firm logic to this process. Since the delimitation process has been mandated for 2026, it makes more sense to implement the Act only then. The Delimitation Act is also likely to increase the size of the Lok Sabha, as we discussed earlier, and once it is done, given the growth of population that we've had, we are now close to 1.4 billion people, we may end up with as much as 846 seats in the Lok Sabha instead of the current 543. That's almost 300 seats more. And if you take a look at some of the states in Uttar Pradesh, for instance, the number of seats may go up from the current 80 to 143 seats, says a study done by the Carnegie Institute in 2019. So in the next 6 years, political parties, that's the BJP's argument, can groom women leaders to contest elections. This gives them time to do so, and this is why they have kept the process of first having the census, then the delimitation process to kick in before the Act becomes operative. But the other factor operating also was that the BJP was clearly worried that if the Act was implemented for the next general elections that is coming up in 2024, there would have been possibly an internal rebellion with many male stalwarts having to give up their seats. A delay in implementation and an expansion of the number of constituencies would prevent such a revolt. That's the logic that went behind it. Psephologist Pradeep Gupta believes, and he opines, and he told India Today, that the delayed implementation would devalue by as much as 50% the electoral benefit that the BJP and Prime Minister Modi would have derived from the passing of the Women's Quota Act. But he goes on to say that the electorate has faith in the Prime Minister's ability to deliver, and that would reduce the downside of it. On their part, the opposition parties were clearly caught napping and off guard by the Modi government's decision to push through the women's quota, particularly in the current session. They were forced to support the move, and the Congress especially, as in the past, the party had moved such a bill too. So that's why you see these massive majorities by which the women's bill was passed in both houses. But the opposition decided to adopt two strategies to reduce the political benefits for the BJP. The first, in Parliament, they demanded the immediate implementation of the Act to expose the BJP's strategy of delaying it for 6 years. The second part of the opposition strategy was to demand specific reservation for other backward classes or OBC communities to be incorporated, and they demanded that a national caste census be conducted for that purpose. Though in government jobs, the OBC reservation is 27% of the total, the actual OBC population is around 52% of the country's total population. So therefore, opposition parties believe that raising concerns about the OBC's neglect in the women's quota could split the BJP strategy of consolidating the Hindu vote as a religious identity. We have to wait and watch whether this approach would deflate the BJP's campaign or in fact give it the great benefit that it believes it would get. Whatever the outcome, there is no doubt that this act is a historic step in empowering India's women. Studies have shown that women's quota for Panchayati Raj has led to important changes in local government policies, as women were more empathetic to people's needs, particularly in rural areas. Initially, of course, there was criticism that the husbands had propped up women candidates and they were ruling by proxy. But 30 years after the Panchayati Raj reservation for women, experts acknowledge it has made a significant difference in governance. Of course, the reservation bills by itself cannot lift the status of women across the country. There are serious issues that women face in India, including discrimination at work, falling participation in the total workforces, gender stereotyping, and not to mention patriarchal control that we all know exist. There needs to be major improvements in women's social and economic indices apart from political representation to become truly equal, for women to become truly equal, and for Indian society to be considered inclusive. Overall, this is a great day for gender equality and is a powerful push towards empowering women. For that, the Modi government deserves full credit for pushing through this historic and enabling legislation. Thank you for listening to this episode of Nothing But the Truth. For more details on the Women's Reservation Act, you can read the cover story in the latest issue of India Today. I look forward to having you with me next week. Nothing but the truth.